We've been talking the last few weeks about prayers that will change our life. We all, to some degree, experience times when we're doing a pretty good job of being focused on God in prayer, and other times when our prayer life wanes a bit. We've come to this point where, for most of us, or many of us, our prayer life is much more like a letter to Santa Claus. We go to God with a list of things that we would like Him to do, or situations that we want to make sure that He's working in. And frankly, many of us probably even share what our desired outcome is, right? God, we want you to make this situation work out exactly this way. God, I'd like a new truck and I want it to be red, please. Things like that, right? But what we see when we begin to dig into God's Word is that we're missing out on a huge opportunity in our prayer life to actually experience the kind of communication with God that we read about in the Old Testament when we read of God walking with people in the evening and being in conversational fellowship with them. We have the opportunity still today to have that soul-to-soul communication with God. So we've been looking at 6 different prayers that will radically change our lives. That if we begin to put these prayers into practice, we will begin to experience that type of communion with God, where we are having conversation with Him. And our prayer life is much more than simply offering up a wish list and then moving on to our next task or the busyness of the day. And we've talked about, how praying for forgiveness really opens up our prayer life. It really separates the barrier that is so present between us and God. And we talked about last week, many of us, in the workplace or at home or at church or other organizations that we're in, and certainly all of us being part of a society with the government that lately is frustrating at best, how the biblical order is present for us to pray for those in authority over us, so that we can live peaceful and quiet lives, is what the Scripture tells us. So today we're going to talk about, then, praying for those dirty, rotten, no good, nasty, miserable people in our lives. That's probably not the word that we would choose to insert. We're going to talk about today praying for our enemies. And we struggle, I think, quite a bit. If I were to ask you right now to raise your hand and say, do you have any enemies? Probably most of us wouldn't raise our hand. We struggle a little bit with understanding who our enemies really are and what enemies are as well. So I want to make sure that we're on the same page before we look at what God has to say in His Word about enemies. First, I want to share with you a story that goes back to the Korean War. And there was a U.S. Army unit serving overseas there, involved in the Korean War. And it was where they were located was a place that was a little bit more peaceful, a little bit less on the front lines of combat. And they hired a local Korean boy to come into their camp and do their cooking and cleaning for them. And grown men, or barely grown men, I guess we can say the 18 to 20-year-olds that are typically in the service, seeing this little boy, they saw this naive young fellow, and they thought they'd have a little bit of fun. And so they started kind of playing pranks on him. Things like putting Vaseline on the handles of the stove and the knobs of the stove. So when you touch them, they're slippery, and he'd have to deal with that goo. And things like, nailing his shoes to the floor, so he'd get up in the morning and not be able to pick his shoes up off the floor, they'd be nailed to the floor. Things like propping a bucket of water up over the door, so when he'd open the door, he'd get doused, and that sort of thing. And they had great fun with this. But finally, they kind of were talking one evening and decided they'd probably gone a little bit too far with how they treated this young fellow. And so, kind of being racked with guilt, they gathered around this boy and apologized for what they had done, and let him know that they weren't going to play these kind of jokes on him anymore. And so this little Korean boy says, So no more sticky on the stove? And they said, no more sticky on the stove. And he says, no more water on the door? He said, no more water on the door. And he says, no more shoes nailed to the floor? And he said, no more of that. And he smiles and he says, okay, no more spit and soup. So, we look at that and, we think that that might not be an enemy type situation, but for that little boy, those grown men really were acting like his enemies. And we see in the little boy in that story a response that we often have to people who oppose us, or we could say are our adversaries. We want to get back at them in some way, shape, or form. And so as we think about enemies, we can think about people that we have that dynamic with. We can think about people that, maybe we ask ourselves as the question, is there anyone in your life right now that you dislike? Is there anyone who mistreats you or makes you upset? Anyone whose soup you would like to spit in, maybe? And maybe not even go that far, but is there anyone who you would prefer to ignore or would walk around the grocery store to avoid? Those types of people really are our enemy in terms of how we're living our lives. And maybe, some of the folks that as names I think are probably starting to populate in your mind, some of the folks that you'll talk about and share things when they're not around, things that we're all Christians in church, right? So we wouldn't lie about these people. But things that maybe would devalue them, or things that might harm them in the viewpoint of others, or would embarrass them. Or maybe we behave in such a way around those people that we know would irritate them. We're intentional in how we act around those individuals, so we know that we'll get under their skin. We see this dynamic a lot between childhood siblings. Frequently, you got siblings that are kind of going at it for a period of time, and so they intentionally act in such a way to aggravate the other. And even as adults, we do that sort of thing as well. So, enemies, for sure, are people that we don't like, that we would say we don't like that person. And often as Christians, we'll kind of take the biblical approach and say, well, I love them like I'm supposed to love them, but I don't like them. Well, okay, that's an enemy in a sense. People that maybe we would get satisfaction out of seeing them suffer a little bit. Or maybe we resent those individuals when they succeed as well. And many times when we have a division in our relationship between ourselves and that person, we think they are the ones who need to seek peace. Not us. We're fine. We haven't done anything wrong. They're the ones that need to approach me first to fix a relationship. And all of those emotions, avoiding people or saying things that are true but maybe a little bit embarrassing to the person, or behaving in a way that aggravates them, or expecting them to move to make peace, all of that makes sense in our worldly human perspective, except we're Christian. And Jesus told us that we are to love people radically, different than everybody else. So what we're going to look at today in God's Word is two different passages from Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And we see, when we look at this from a biblical overall place, we see that the Beatitudes were kind of Jesus' intro to the Sermon on the Mount. And the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, they shall inherit the kingdom of heaven. Those sorts of things that we may remember from previous teaching. The Beatitudes give us attributes or characteristics of how a mature Christian is supposed to be. We're supposed to be poor in spirit. We're supposed to be meek. Those sorts of things. And then Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount kicks into this tremendous teaching that steps into the middle of life 2,000 years ago and life today as we experience, and challenges us on some of the biggest things that we run into, like our attitudes about money, like our attitudes about anger, like our attitudes about how we treat one another. And we see in our Bible, as it is today, we see the teachings from the Sermon on the Mount accounted for primarily in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. And the really neat thing is, we're going to look at a passage from Matthew and Luke today, and the really neat thing is, they covered two different aspects of it. Much like if I were to have a really inspired sermon that was really profound and significant, you might want to try to write it down, or not, I don't know. But if you were to try to write it down, you wouldn't catch everything that I'm saying word for word. But between multiple groups of people, then you would have a much clearer idea of exactly what I was saying word for word. So as Jesus was teaching, we have Matthew capturing this, and then we have Luke coming behind and talking to people who were there and documenting what they learned from it. And so we get a much clearer idea of what Jesus was teaching during the Sermon on the Mount. So the first passage we are going to look at this morning is found in Matthew chapter 5. And we're going to start with verse 21 and go through verse 26. I'm going to grab a drink here quick. So Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, 'Raca,' is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny." So we glean some really interesting information from Jesus' teaching there that fits our life so well. We can look at it and see, first off, Jesus is saying, hey, it's not just the action that is the sinful problem in your life, but it's the attitude, the thought, the emotion that's behind it as well. And Jesus is saying, we all agree and understand that murder is wrong, and there's consequences for murder. You will get punished for murder, right? And I think, today we would say taking of life is wrong, murder is wrong. We don't do that. But Jesus says, and he goes to the emotion that exists behind murder. And he says, but you who say murder is wrong, you'll get angry with people. And that's just as bad. If you get angry with your brother, sister, neighbor, the word we like to insert is everyone or anyone. If you get angry with anyone, it is as bad as murder because you have that same emotion behind you that leads to murder. While you may have the self-control or the fear of punishment or imprisonment that would keep you from actually killing the person, you have no problem being angry with that individual. And he goes into something that made sense to the people at the time and says, if you say to somebody, "Raca," you're accountable to the Sanhedrin. So what he's saying is essentially, if you look at somebody and say, "You're an idiot," well, that's rude, and you're accountable to the judgment of the people around you. But if you look at somebody and say, the NIV translates it, "You fool," a good comparison or a better comparison would be to say, "You're stupid," as opposed to "You're an idiot," "You're stupid," then you're in danger of the fire of hell. And let's take a minute and talk about the differences there. "You're an idiot" means You're doing okay with the information you have. You just don't have much information to make your decisions upon. Right? You're stupid, on the other hand, is something that is demeaning and lowers the value of the person that you're talking to and places you above them. You're saying, I'm better, I'm more important than you. Your thought process is worthless. So the distinction that Jesus is making is, there's things that we do and say out of anger or in general that are rude, and you're going to be accountable to the structures of man and how you experience that, or what punishment or what consequences are there. But there are things where if you go into the point of demeaning God's creation, then you're in danger of the fires of hell. So there's consequences to our action, right? Earthly and heavenly consequences that are problematic for us, that we have to deal with, that we have to face. And then the next point that we can glean from Jesus' teaching here is that conflict with others separates us from God. Our prayer life, we are seeking to have conversation with God, for Him to hear us. And how many of you think it would be awesome to hear God audibly, hear God actually speak to you? How many of you think that would be incredible? That would be incredible. And so we hope for that type of communication between us and God, and yet we're left dissatisfied. And so we can see here a significant possibility of why that's the case. Jesus is saying what we have in verse 23 and 24. Hey, if you're coming before God, if you're offering your gift at the altar, if you're coming before God, and you realize that you're in conflict with somebody, what does He say? Don't come to God. Go and fix that with that person, and then come to God. See, if all that we have been commanded amounts to love God and love everyone, and we are in conflict with God's creation, another person, we can't have that fellowship with Him because we're in violation of what He told us to do. Right? If we are going to be in conflict or be angry with another person who is just as important to Him as we are, then we can't come before God because we have that unhealthy, that unholy attitude in our life and that disobedience as well. And then we see Jesus tells us to settle it quickly. That conflict that you need to take care of before you can expect to have fellowship or communion with God. You need to settle it quickly. Because the longer it goes on, and we all know this from personal experience, the longer a conflict or disagreement goes on, the worse it gets. It begins to take on a life of its own. It grows into something, and you may know people like this, where we have two families, legendary, we think of the Hatfields and McCoys, but maybe families that you know, two families that are in conflict with each other, and it's that hatred or that disagreement has been passed on from generation to generation, to the point where I don't like you, but I can't remember why. Right? We see that. We know that there's people we aren't supposed to like, we aren't supposed to spend time with, but we can't remember why. Romeo and Juliet's coming to mind, the Capulets and the Montagues. Mm-hmm. So settle it quickly. Go while you can just address the heart of the problem and settle it with that person. Don't let it take on a life of its own. Don't let it become a legend through you sharing your frustration with other people, through you talking about that person or situation with other people and them doing likewise. So pretty soon the whole community is in on it, and some agree that you should hate him, and you should hate her, and so on and so forth. Settle it quickly. Now let's move on to Jesus' teaching in Luke chapter 6. kind of envision this because where they fall in the gospel accounts of the Sermon on the Mount, I think this teaching, what we just looked at in Matthew and what we're about to look at in Luke, I think they really were one right after the other as Jesus was teaching this. But in Luke chapter 6, we get a little bit different twist on this. Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 36. We'll start at 27. But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So, Jesus goes through what we read in Matthew and what we just talked about in Matthew. It gets to this point, and I like this, and as somebody who's up here teaching on a weekly or more basis, I can relate to this real well. Jesus looks at them in the sermon and says, I tell you who hear me. See, he knew his audience. He knew that some people at church that day weren't paying attention. I tell you who hear me, Jesus says, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Radical thought, right? And we see exactly what we're talking about. Pray for those who mistreat you. And then we go into this teaching that is some of the most wrongly applied scripture we probably ever encounter in our lives. If someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. And I know as a man, I have wrestled with that and still, try to figure out, what does that mean, Does that mean if I walk up to you, Glenn, and just pop you in the face, you're supposed to turn and let me hit you on the other side? Not so much. I don't see that happening, do you? No. That's not what Jesus was talking about there. Rather, what he was describing when he says, hey, if someone strikes you on the cheek, turn them the other cheek. Or if someone takes your coat, don't stop them from taking it, just give it to them. What Jesus is saying is that as Christians, we are the ones who are called to yield in our relationships. If we're butting heads with somebody, out of the love that we have for God and His creation, we are the ones who are supposed to yield. We don't expect them to. We are the ones who are supposed to give, who are supposed to step aside, who are supposed to value peace and relationship and harmony with that individual is greater than the thing that we are arguing about. Let it go. Don't hang on to the argument. Let it go. Stop and think. Does this really matter? What I like to say conversationally, particularly as we have debates within church or with fellow Christians, is this a heaven or hell issue? Are we arguing about something that will determine whether somebody goes to heaven or hell? If we're not, let it go. It's not a big deal. And so that's what Jesus is saying with this turn the other cheek or give them their coat if they're trying to steal it. He's saying, look at it. Does it really matter? Is what you're arguing about that important that you're willing to lose fellowship with that individual and potentially fellowship with God? The answer is probably no in about any case. So let it go. As Christians, we move. We yield. And then this picture of radical love that we get. Jesus says, hey, if you love the people who love you, that's not a big deal. Everybody does that. If you love the people that love you, everybody does that. That's not radical love. That's not the love as Christians we're called to. And if you do good to the people who do good to you, if you're nice to people who are nice to you, that's not a big deal. Everybody does that. Sinners do that. That does not distinguish you as a follower of Jesus Christ. And this is where it gets touchy, because we get talking about that money thing that's so important to many of us. If you lend to people and expect them to pay you back, come on. That's a sinner idea. That's not the Christian idea. And Jesus says in turn, you want to be radical in your love? You want to be Christ-like in your love? You want to be like Him, like Jesus in your love? Those people who are your enemies, those people in whom you would delight to see something go wrong in their life, love them. And remember, as a reminder, we've been talking about this for a couple of years. Love, as Jesus spoke it, and up until the last 150 years or so, is how we act towards one another. That's not an emotion. It's how we act towards one another. Love your enemies. Do good to them. Be charitable. Be kind. Lend to them without expecting to get anything back. I think we can look at that and safely say, love them, do good to them, and expect absolutely nothing in return. Unconditional love. That's the radical love that Jesus is saying that we need to have, not just towards those who we get along with, but especially towards those who we would say we really don't like. So how do we do this? It's kind of a tough thing to do, right? I want to wrap up with another story. It's a story I've read of a young man. Not really anything remarkable about this young man in terms of his appearance or lifestyle. He kind of took over the family business, learned his dad's trade, and followed him in that trade. But the one thing that his friends would tell you about him is how kind and compassionate he was towards people. It didn't matter what you looked like or where you came from, whether he knew you or not. You instantly felt loved by this guy. And this guy was a really spiritual person too. Not very religious, but a really spiritual guy. And so as he grew into adulthood, people were kind of drawn to that about him. He seemed to have a relationship with God that they desired. They wanted to have that same type of relationship with God. And so, he would find himself talking around campfires. Remember, kids in the youth group, I told you that bonfires are biblical. Jesus taught around bonfires, and we see a lot of great people doing that. So this guy would do likewise. He would teach around bonfires and share his relationship with God, so that others would be able to learn from his example. And, it got to a point where he really kind of got under the feathers of some of the people in the neighborhood as well. Some of the people who didn't necessarily agree that we should be kind and compassionate to everyone, or some of the people who thought his relationship with God was a fake one. And so, this unhappy, angry few began to spread their venom through gossip. They would share with their neighbors and their friends. This guy, he is so annoying, he's getting it so wrong, and they would spend their mornings just buzzing with gossip about this fellow. And it got to the point where, their venom had spread, their gossip had spread and taken hold of so many people that they decided that they needed to get rid of this guy out of their community. They needed him gone. Yeah, he took over his dad's business, and I guess in some regards he's done some alright things, but he needs to go. He's creating way too many problems. And so they plot to get rid of him. And they get to the point where they can't stand him so much that they devise a scheme to get a death row prisoner set free in exchange for this fellow's life. And this fellow, at the moment of his execution, looked at this angry crowd who couldn't stand him, who had plotted to get rid of him. And he looked at them, understanding that any who opposed his God opposed him. Any who opposed his God were his enemies. And he looked out at this crowd of enemies, and he could see in that moment people that had come before who had hated his God. He could see in that moment people who would come after that time, who hated God and refused to have fellowship with him and relationship with him. And in his moment of praying for enemies, he says a simple prayer that we probably all have heard. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Jesus looked across time and saw his enemies, people who would sin against God, people who had sinned against God. He looked across time in that moment and saw us, you and I, and in radical love prayed for his enemies and simply said, Father, forgive them. That's a prayer that changes lives. So pray for your enemies. Not only will it change your life, it'll change other lives too.